This time around, we're looking at lifetime value, and that comes from the valuable growth section of the wheel there in the cash pillar. And it's part of that. How do we make sure that as we grow our businesses, we're thinking of value and not just simply of short-term profitability, but that we're creating long-term value. And so part of lifetime value, or part of valuable growth, is thinking about customer lifetime value. And you can define value in many ways, but one simple way to look at it is that for every amount that we spend on acquiring a customer, that we're bringing in a multiple of that in terms of our lifetime value. And a rule of thumb ratio that is increasingly used, and it is particularly with recurring revenue type businesses and SaaS type businesses, is that the lifetime value of your customers should be at least 3 times the cost of acquiring them. And that's known as that LTV to CAC ratio. So LTV, lifetime value, CAC, customer acquisition cost. So that's broadly speaking what it's about, but it's not just about for recurring revenue businesses. So why is it important? Well, there's a few key things. First of all, you can't improve what we don't measure. We know that. Once you start measuring lifetime value and start thinking about it and breaking it down into the components of what drives that lifetime value, then that enables us to think about employing specific strategies around maybe things like pricing, sales, but segmentation, but frequency of purchase, the cost of sales, but also particularly things like customer retention, and building ultimately a more valuable business by making it more scalable and stable and resilient, increasing that profitability. It also means that we're likely to, if we focus on it, it should help improve our decision making on customer acquisition. What you learn from typical customer, from segmentation, and thinking about the more profitable customers, the ones that do lead to a higher lifetime value perhaps than others. And it then feeds into improving things like forecasting, because it will then help us to make better forecasts. We've got a relatively good long-term view as to what's likely to happen with the lifetime value of the customers. So it should help us in all sorts of aspects beyond just simply working out that number ratio. And an out of balance business model is what we see quite a lot, and actually slightly out of focus as well, looking at that slide. But an out of balance business model sort of comes when that cost to acquire a customer is that much greater than the monetization of it, than that lifetime value. So hopefully this is not a position that we're in. And so when I go through this, I am going to pull up a formula or two. So it might look a little bit mathematical, but just again, everything about this is important about thinking, what does that formula mean? What does that mean that we can think about to help to improve the ratios within it? So those of you that are perhaps less mathematically inclined from others, don't worry about that. Just think about the implications that it has. So we're looking for the idea that the lifetime value is at least 3 times the customer acquisition. But why do we get into that sometimes, that out of balance, where it's not quite right? And the part of the reason is that a lot of our efforts are focused, and we see this a lot, are focused on acquiring a customer. So all this stuff here, we're generating awareness, attracting customers, we're nurturing them, we're trying to convert them, do negotiation, and then we've won that deal, and then we go back and we start again and we get new customers, and it's all about that, or a lot of it's about that first transaction. And of course, that's a difficult model to replicate and to make work. And what we sometimes are missing out on is the fact that a lot of this extra value will come from the clients that we've already won, and then making sure that we develop those over time and we retain them, we get them coming back as frequently as possible, and we're expanding that business. And a good example that drove that home to me recently was a classmate of mine from when I did my MBA. He runs a business called Evatix. When he took that business over, the annual value of each customer was about £2,000, and he increased that to £20,000 per customer over a period of about 4 years by focusing on developing those relationships primarily with the customers. So where they were in one particular corner of a company, how can they branch out into other divisions of the company and grow that side of things. So thinking about that lifetime value and how it can nurture clients is, at the end of the day, a lot of what this is around. So there's that basic formula. Our lifetime value to CAC, customer acquisition cost ratio, is the one divided by the other. And just a little rub, lifetime value is not just the revenues that we're going to get from that customer, but we need to put an element of gross margin on that as well, or contribution margin, as you'll hear in a moment, where what's it cost to service that customer, so that we've actually got a contribution that's worth for that lifetime value, not just the customer acquisition cost. So here we go. Here comes the bit of maths for us. So lifetime value, average transaction value. So what's the average sale, the value of each transaction that you get from a customer, times the average number of transactions in a period. So if we're looking at it, say, over a year, how many transactions in a year, times the number of years, so the retention period that we're likely to keep that customer for, times that contribution margin, which should take into account not just the direct cost of sales, but any, if you don't include your time in servicing those customers, then you should. So that's the basic formula. So transaction value times the number of transactions times the length of time that you keep them for, and that contribution margin. All right, so that's that side of things. And then the customer acquisition cost is your total sales and marketing costs in a period divided by the average number of transactions in that period. So if we spent £100,000 on sales and marketing in that period, I wish, and we've made a certain number of sales, acquired a certain number of new customers, that should be average number of new customers that are in there. Then that means that we've so if we've got spent £100,000 and we've got 1,000 new customers, then it's £100 per acquisition. So we think about simple example of it. If average transaction value is £50, 12 transactions in a year, 7 years on average to keep them, and maybe it's a 50% contribution margin, then the lifetime value of that customer is about £2,100. If we then calculate the cost of acquiring that customer, if we've made £12,000 worth of sales and we've acquired 24 new customers, then that means that we've got an average customer acquisition cost of 500, which if we then divide the two together, we end up with a 4.2 ratio. All right, so there's the maths. But what does that make us? What does that make us think about? So some of the factors that we need to be thinking about. So what are the advantages of lifetime value, or the things that we need to be thinking about? So first of all, about improving that customer retention, because the length of time that we keep people for is one of the biggest factors in the lifetime value. So avoiding customer attrition or churn is what we really want to be doing. We also want to be thinking about driving repeat sales. So you can use lifetime value to track the average number of visits over a year, over the customer lifetime, and use that to strategize and think of ways that we can drive the repeat business side of things. So obviously, if we've got a recurring revenue model, that's one aspect of it. How can we increase that? If we don't have a recurring revenue model, a subscription type model, how can we get a customer coming back for repeat business and bake it into the offer, for example? How can we encourage higher value sales as well? So because a key component of that formula is the average transaction value. So how can we find ways to increase that order value? And then also think about the margin, of course, so that whether it's the gross margin or that contribution margin. So how can we make sure that we can maximize the margin within that? And then in terms of increasing our effectiveness of our sales and marketing activities in that customer acquisition cost, how can we make sure what could we do to improve the ratio of the number of customers that we're getting for the amount that we're spending. And this is where segmentation might come into. We might find that we're more successful with certain customer groups in acquiring those, and if that matches in as well, that they're better from a long-term retention point of view, then happy days. But thinking about it in that way should help us to start thinking about, okay, where's our marketing being most effective, and maybe that's where we should focus. And just looking at that, and in terms of putting it onto some kind of the back on that balance here again, if we look on the right hand side here, some of the things that are not so good that we want to work on improving are the churn rates and customer satisfaction. We want to make sure that is as good as possible. Otherwise, that's tipping the balance in the wrong way. And if we're looking at the green arrow moving up here, how can we make sure we're getting that recurring revenue, the scalable pricing, looking for opportunities to upsell? But there's lots of other things that we might think about once we start to get into this, and that's part of the trick, is to have a quick look at those drivers and think, okay, well, what sort of things could we do to impact on improving the lifetime value and reducing the customer acquisition cost? And those of you that have been working with us for a little while and coming to ScaleUp Club will know we've talked before about things like the 7 financial levers and the cash conversion cycle, and it hooks right back into those as well, and thinking each 90 days, what's an improvement that we could do around that cash area? So could there be a lifetime value type improvement that we could start to focus on over the next 90 days that might really make a difference in the long term to our business? So that essentially is what it's about. It doesn't matter whether it's a recurring revenue type business or not. We can be thinking about how we can make improvements to improve that lifetime value. If we have got a recurring revenue business, then there's a slight difference to it, and that typically then that gives us, if we know that every month people are coming in and buying our service, then we can use that monthly recurring revenue as that transaction value, essentially, multiply it by the contribution margin. But instead of guessing or tracking over years the lifetime value, we can divide by the churn rate. So if we know that we're losing 10% of customers every month, then we would divide by that 0.1, because that essentially, if that's our average churn rate, that essentially dividing by 0.1 means that on average we've got a 10-month lifespan with each business. So we would it's a simpler formula, and it shows the impact of churn rate, because obviously if you can reduce that 10% to 5%, then essentially you double the lifetime value of that customer, because you're doubling the amount of time that they're likely to stay with us. So that's lifetime value to customer acquisition cost. So a couple of key takeaways. It's lifetime value is that measure of the average customer's gross margin contribution that's generated over the entire relationship with us. Comparing it to the customer acquisition cost is a really practical, it's relatively straightforward to do. There's some complications in some of the detail, but it's a relatively practical thing to do in estimating the company's scalability. It gives us a really good measure as to whether that business model is in fact scalable, or whether we're just going to end up really with a hand-to-mouth business and it's going to struggle on the growth. And it also gives us an understanding and a focus on LTV and CAC, gives us that understanding and can yield significant insights into those strategies and tactics that we can use to improve that ratio over time. So that's all about lifetime value and customer acquisition cost. We'll open up some questions in a minute, but first I'd like to introduce Jeremy Strong of Invoco Telecoms to just put a little bit of real business experience on some of those aspects that I've been talking about. So Jeremy is somebody that we've been working with for a little while. He's doing some great things at Invoco Telecoms. He knows his numbers inside out, and has been thinking about elements of the lifetime value for a little while and building it into his business. So Jeremy, I'm going to hand over to you, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Let me just share my screen. Everyone see that? Yeah.
Yeah, we can, Jeremy.
Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. And as Kevin kind of mentioned, we've been working on, we're looking at customer lifetime value in our business for quite a while now. But before we're talking about customer lifetime value, I'm going to talk about marketing to begin with. So in my kind of simplistic brain, my definition of marketing, another equation, unfortunately, marketing equals creativity plus maths. Now, many of us might have the ability to do the creativity piece in-house, but the good news is that if you don't have that creativity, then there's plenty of outsourced marketing agencies that you can outsource that activity to. The maths part of the equation, the business maths around marketing, is less easy to outsource because it requires having systems and processes in place in order to be able to measure things like return on investment and all that kind of stuff. So that piece of the jigsaw is quite difficult to outsource. And I think that's something, because particularly small business owners, we tend to kind of struggle with a little bit. So here's an example from my dim and distant past of bad maths. So when we first started doing Google Ads, when we launched our kind of B2B products about 7 years or so ago, we started doing some Google Ads campaigns on virtual numbers. Now, virtual numbers were characterized by being a very low cost service, kind of roughly about £1 a month, and they're contract free. So customers can cancel their services at any time. Now, at that stage, I wish it was still like this now, but at that stage, it was roughly between 12 and 30 pence per click on those Google Ads to drive people to our website. But we weren't really tracking conversions particularly well. Now, from my perspective, I knew intuitively, although we weren't tracking it particularly well, if we were spending £400 every month, we'd get roughly 40 to 60 new customers every month in, month out. So we were spending £400, no more, no less, and it became just an overhead that we were happy to spend as long as the customer numbers were growing. However, one of our other products, which is our cloud-based phone systems, which is a really important product for us because it contributes about 80% of the margin of our business. It's a higher value product, but again, still a low starting point at £3 a month. And again, contract free, so customers can cancel at any point in time. Now, that was costing us between £8 and £10 a click, so that's a different kind of beast entirely. And we were estimating up to £120 to acquire a new customer. Now, at that stage, thinking of, if I'm looking at spending £120 to acquire a customer that may only ever spend £3 before cancelling after 30 days, for me, that's a complete non-starter. Totally uncomfortable with that idea. Just thought, well, ultimately, that's too expensive for us to do. So we stopped doing advertising on that product completely, which really kind of, as our biggest value product, a really stupid thing to do. Marketing was just far too risky, and we just decided to stop it. And that was because we had no understanding at that point in time of the customer lifetime value. Now, as Kevin kind of pointed out, with the formula for lifetime value is pretty straightforward and pretty intuitive, and this was the formula that I was aware of. Now, the good thing about this is most of the data in this formula is pretty easily extractable from your accounting software. So average transaction value, average number of transactions, contribution margin, and so on. That should be pretty easy to get from your accountancy package. And if not, I'm sure your accountants or bookkeeper will be able to extract that information for you. The difficulty in this piece of the equation that I didn't understand or couldn't really get my head around was the retention period, particularly as we were offering, bringing new products to market. I just simply didn't know whether the customer was going to be a customer for 6 months or 6 years, and that obviously makes a massive difference to the customer lifetime value. So because I didn't feel like we could measure that metric particularly well, we just stopped trying to measure it because we didn't know what the retention period would be. Fortunately, working with Kevin, we've realized for recurring revenue businesses, there is a different formula, which is the average monthly recurring revenue per customer times the contribution margin divided by churn rate. Now, at that point in time, churn rate wasn't something that we were actively measuring, but it was something that we could measure. So we kind of started developing systems to do that. So what we do every month now, we did a bit of work under the hood. I'm not going to lie, it was a little bit of a project to do, but now when we run our monthly billing run every month, we insert all of that data into our cloud-based dashboarding software, which we use for all of our KPI systems, which is Sife. Now, Sife is fantastic, but there are plenty of other alternatives out there, all broadly do the same kind of thing. But the nice thing is, now we've done the work for this, that data is inserted into the system on an automated basis every month, and we can kind of track that data over time. So the first thing we're measuring now, which we weren't before, was the revenue churn rate, and we break that down by individual product. Now, the target that we're looking at to achieve as a business is around about 4%. So we're kind of there or thereabouts, but we've still got a little bit of work to do to kind of get us below 4%. But the really important thing about this graph is looking at the trends. So if your revenue churn rate or your churn rate is slowly increasing over time, that obviously indicates there's something in the business that needs to be addressed, whether it's pricing strategy, we're not competitive in the market anymore. Maybe there's customer service issues, technical issues, and so on. So that's a really important trend for us to kind of measure. So now because of that, because we're measuring the churn rate and because we're aware of this new formula now, we can work out the customer lifetime value, again, broken down by month. Now, this, as you can see here, the lifetime value over the last 3 months for us is kind of trending down, which ultimately you think, oh, that's not a good situation to be. You want the lifetime value to kind of go up. But one of the things I would recommend if you are going to do this is to build a rolling 3-month average graph based on this data as well, to smooth out those peaks and troughs so you can see what the proper trend is over time. Because we know ultimately in December and January, core volumes always go down for us anyway. So that's important to kind of track that over time. And lifetime value to CAC ratio, as kind of Kevin mentioned earlier on, the customer acquisition cost is a really important piece of the jigsaw for us. 2 things for us to note about LTV to CAC ratio is, firstly, it should always be greater than 1, because if the cost to acquire a customer exceeds the amount of revenue you're going to earn from that customer over time, then you're growing broke. So you're getting new customers, but you're going broke at the same time. So that's something that needs to be avoided. And secondly, as Kevin pointed out, the LTV to CAC ratio should be in excess of 3 in order to have a sustainable and scalable business. So I know there's been lots of acronyms, terrible acronyms already in this presentation, but I'm going to create a new one. And Kevin, you're more than welcome to add this to the next edition of your book, which is TCAC, which is Target Customer Acquisition Cost. So if the lifetime value, if we know that the lifetime value needs to be at least 3 times higher than the CAC, then that also implies that the CAC for a scalable business needs to be 1/3 of the lifetime value. So we have another graph which shows, again, broken down by product, the maximum that we're willing to spend to acquire a customer for each one of these product lines. Now, this is the most important graph actually for our marketing team, because it dictates everything that they spend on their marketing, whether it's Google Ads or anything else. So that's how we use lifetime value in the business.
That is fantastic. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
Right. So I think we can, that's a really good insight into how Jeremy uses it within his business. And Jeremy has a very data-driven business, as you can tell. Not all of us do. Those of us that do, great. There's lots of things that we might then apply and think about directly from what Jeremy's saying. But even if we're not got such a lot of data within our business, we can still take some of those key lessons and think about how do they apply and how could we use it within our business. I'm going to open up to questions in a moment. I think Emma asked a question earlier on in the chat around how do we calculate the gross margin or the contribution margin. As Jeremy said, we should be able to pull it out of our accounting, certainly at a macro level, but ideally if we've looked at our different service lines within our accounting package, we should be able to pull it out from there. But equally, Emma, you could think about it from a first principles point of view. So if you're going out and you're you're doing an exterior clean, say on a driveway or something like that, then how long does that take to do? What are the material costs, obviously, that have gone into it? They come straight out of it, but then also in terms of then the time and an hourly rate that you're paying your people to do that on will get you most of the way to getting a contribution margin that you could use to forecast and calculate things going forwards.
So it's like our break even, is it? What, like the running cost of the business sort of thing?
The gross margin is essentially so what you're trying to get to is off of the sales line. So you might have charged £100 for a job, right? But actually it's cost us 50 quid to do that job. Yeah. So the gross margin is 50%. And if that 50 quid is made up of £10 worth of soap and water, but £40 worth of labor, to actually direct labor to do that specific job, that's what I'm talking about there. So it's so for every 100 quid of revenue, if it's cost us 50 quid, it's the 50 quid that we should be using, or 50% if we're going to multiply ongoing. Granger, anything you wanted to add to the conversation on lifetime value?
The key thing for me, Jeremy, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I love the extension of the formula of how you can define to your marketing team how much they can actually spend on each product. So wow, that was brilliant. Thank you. But the key thing for me is not necessarily the maths, okay, because some of us can get hung up on maths and find out everything else. Is just understanding what those formulas are saying, and those that key lever that Kevin's talking about, making that balance greater than 3, and focusing on your retention. How well is your customer retention? Focusing on the average value that you're getting from them. So it's looking at the formulas and thinking how you would use them to adjust that lever, rather than specifically getting focused in on the maths every single time. Though Jeremy's presentation showed that if you can then use it over a huge amount of data and get the data sets working for you, you can use it to a very successful degree. So thank you.
Brilliant. Good. Louise, anything you want to add before we throw it open to questions?
No, I don't think so, actually. I think we've covered it really comprehensively, and I think looking at the numbers is always interesting. It's finding those key rules of thumb for me. Just find 2 or 3 key rules of thumb that you are able to use on a regular basis to just, are we doing this thing right? Is it going in the right direction? And I think just to say, find a couple of ratios that work for you.
Good. So any questions then around the room, either for us or for Jeremy? We got Jeremy here. It'd be a great opportunity if you do have any specific questions for Jeremy.
Everybody's still trying to do the maths, Kevin.
Yeah, I think so. I think
Mark Richards.
Mark.
Yeah. So it's based around how the money multiplier works, based around risk and cost of acquisition. Once we get to a point where we start creating opportunity, and we're not looking at 1 or 2 opportunities, and I'm looking at probably a bit more higher value transactions, or monthly or weekly billing. So I can use an old business of mine. We were billing, say, 300 grand a week across 20, 30, 40 companies, depending. At what point, Jeremy, would you suggest that volume takes over from the money multiplier? So sheer volume of sale then takes away from that 3-time multiplier. Can that multiplier go down with volume?
I must admit, I don't. I think I'll pass that one to Kevin, because I think the money multiplier piece is something I've not really.
So the LTV, so that times 3. You're looking at your times 3, yes, or minimum of. At what point would you be happy that you have sufficient opportunity? Many opportunities coming in, you're making your times 3. At what point do you then say, okay, I'm prepared to drop my multiplier from say below to 2.5, because I know that it's because I need a 3 to keep me at a certain point. But if I have the volume, 3 times the volume, can I lower my expectation?
I think the thing for me, probably the one driver that would make me kind of reduce that figure would be the payback period for the product. So, you know, for us, you know, the payback period is kind of over multiple years. We certainly wouldn't look at reducing below 3 if we're looking at kind of 18-month or 2-year payback period. But if the payback period was within kind of like 2 or 3 months, which, you know, potentially in your industry it could be, then that's the scenario I would think about going below 3.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That's a good answer. I like that. It's good question. Good question too, because my first reaction was never. Frankly, because otherwise you're just running the risk of just having kind of business where you're tearing your hair out all the time, and actually there's no real money coming out of the business. And certainly from an investor's point of view, any investor is going to want to know that is well north of 3. But that's an interesting answer that Jeremy's given about the payback period. So if you do get a big initial transaction that covers a lot of that customer acquisition cost in one go, then or even better, then that might change the thinking a little bit. I still wouldn't try and have a model that drops below 3. I'd want to keep it over 3. But that does raise another interesting point, because, you know, Jeremy's given some great examples about how over that lifetime he's going to get that, and how he get that value, and how he uses it to drive how much people are prepared to spend, or he's prepared to spend on acquiring a customer. Of course, the lifetime value comes in over the lifetime value of that client. So if you're going to get a 3 times ratio over 7 years, you're not going to spend all that money right at the beginning. You know, so if you're going to get £10,000 over 3 years, you're not going to spend £3,000 now on acquiring that customer and then keep spending more and more £3,000, because your hole will get bigger and bigger and bigger before you get that money back over the seven years. So you got to be careful in it. So it's a balancing act, like everything else in business, but it helps to think in those terms, and just with some of those caveats. Right, great question.
I have a question, Kevin, Jeremy. So it's depending on the industries, because I mean certain industries perform differently than others. I think versus SaaS, I'm into more of bespoke digital stuff, where probably kind of, you know, number of transactions could be low, but high basket value. So in that case, is it treated same? I'm saying, I mean, as an example, depending on the industry domain, is it treated as same 3x, or can be multipliers? Because sometimes the sales cycle is also longer for certain businesses versus others, right? So
yeah. I think it's used more in certain industries than others. Okay, and certainly in recurring revenue businesses, then it's absolutely used. But it's the thinking, as Granger was saying, the thinking applies to any business. So the principles, and trying to make sure that actually we are thinking about how do we increase this lifetime value? How do we, if it is a project type business and we're doing one big project, how could we get a second bite at the cherry? You know, how could we bake in some kind of further on revenue beyond that? So yes, the initial pricing, but how do we give ourselves other opportunities to do more with that client over time, and other ways of using some of those key levers within the thinking? So I think it applies. Well, I know it applies to any business. Yeah. It's at the level of what level that you want to apply it, but the thinking absolutely is sound across any business.
Because you know, follow-up question, sorry. So I mean, in a tech business anyway, when you kind of complete the one-off and then there is a continuation, if you sign up for someone, then definitely the customer lifetime value is probably greater. So it could be much more than 3x in a business, but initial setup could take longer, isn't it? So that's the question. Yeah.
Yes, and of course but if it takes you 6 months to woo a client and get them to come on board, that should all be included in your customer acquisition cost, because you've got your time or your salespeople's time in talking to those customers. That should all be included in your customer acquisition cost. And that is one of the mistakes, actually. So thank you for pointing that out, because one of the errors that people make is they just think of the direct money they've spent on adverts, whether it be Google Ads, pay-per-click, or whatever. And they don't think of the time for their salespeople or their marketing people in having the discussions with the clients. And you need to include that.